Netanyahu is a terrible force in this world, and his government is shockingly destructive and the progenitor of massive war crimes. And Netanyahu has had in his head for 30 years an attack on Iran and a regime change through war with Iran. This continues until today. As soon as Trump got into office in his first term, under the leadership or the guidance or whatever you want to call it of Netanyahu, the U.S. abandoned the JCPOA, killed it. So it killed an agreement that was reached about denuclearizing or ending any kind of nuclear arms development in return for ending the sanctions regime. The United States gave up its sovereignty when it comes to Middle East policy to the Israeli government a long time ago, to these extremists in Israel a long time ago. Our foreign policy is reckless, understandable from an American interest point of view, a world interest point of view. It only makes sense when seen through the eyes of Israeli extremists. And that's what we have. I thought Trump was going to avoid war in the Middle East. Such is not the case right now. That ceasefire evaporated. It was blatantly, crudely, violently, flagrantly blown up by the Israelis. And Trump didn't say one word. So the JCPOA was the agreement to end Iran's nuclear program. The U.S. willfully killed it. Then during the Biden years, the Iranians sent countless signals to Biden. We want to restart. We want to make JCPOA work. We want to negotiate with you. There were peace feelers all the time. Then when President Pezeshkian was elected, he came to the UN General Assembly this past September, and it was all about peace. Of course, Netanyahu, who is a man of murder and violence, wants to hear nothing of it. He wants the United States to attack. So what we have is not a question of how to negotiate. It's a question of threats and violence. And that's where we are to this moment. If you try to ask me to rationalize this or explain what's going on in the American mentality, all I can come up with is that the U.S. officials are just doing the bidding of Netanyahu, who I regard as properly indicted by the International Criminal Court for crimes against humanity. The United States does not want a war, but in practice, they might, because the big surprise for me over the last several weeks is the complete collapse of any U.S. interest in a ceasefire in Gaza, in a peace process. For whatever reason, the United States ended up giving the green light to Netanyahu to continue the Israeli murderous attacks throughout the region. And of course, the U.S. attacked the Houthis and is reportedly moving bombers and other material to the region, which could be presaging some kind of actual war. I would have said this is extremely unlikely before. On the other hand, the events of the last few weeks, both inside the United States and in the Middle East, are alarming, at least alarming to me. They basically have seemed to signal the full control of the extremist Israeli government over U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. And if that's the case, we would be headed to some kind of attack on Iran. The truth is, Iran has been looking for a diplomatic solution for a decade. And that's what brought us to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, in the first place, roughly 10 years ago. The U.S. government is run by Israel, by the Israeli government. Why and how? It's a little hard to say, but it is the unbelievable fact that this brazenness, this recklessness, this cruelty, this arrogance from this extremist Israeli government controls American policy vis-a-vis speech in the United States now. It's shocking but true. Look, what is so shocking, first of all, those are the words of a man with an international arrest warrant for war crimes and crimes against humanity. I'm speaking of Netanyahu. He is a mass murderer. He is a killer. He commits war crimes, and he has control over American foreign policy and over American domestic policy now. That's the fact. This just means continued war. It means continued war, not only in Gaza, but really war in the West Bank, war in Lebanon, war in Syria, war in Yemen, and perhaps war in Iran. This is the game plan, actually, is for Israel, backed by, funded by, armed by the U.S. to dominate the Middle East. It's an abomination in my view, because it's just mass killing, mass destruction, mass slaughter in Gaza. And if anyone stands up to it, the Netanyahu doctrine is kill them, overthrow them. So this is where we are right now. But the whole point of this is that to have peace in the Middle East requires a political settlement. It requires a state of Palestine alongside the state of Israel. Netanyahu's whole political career and his government is just rabidly against the state of Palestine. That's the essence of this Israeli extremist government. They want to ethnically cleanse Palestine so that Israel will control all of the land. This is stated by these extremists. The Arabs in the Arab League, in the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, country by country, has said, look, we can have peace, we can normalize relations with Israel. It's straightforward. Two states living side by side. That's it. And this is the only path to peace. The only other way is ongoing slaughter, which is the Netanyahu policy, I'm afraid. And it seems like it's the Trump policy, or could be the Trump policy. It seems like that's the direction that things are moving after a glimmer of hope of Trump insisting on a ceasefire in Gaza. You never know, but right now, things do not look good. The whole point is that the U.S. government and Israel, side by side, don't talk about the real path to peace, period. What they want to do at gunpoint or at slaughter or at ethnic cleansing is make way for this greater Israel and make everyone bow down to it. This is true with Lebanon the same way. The U.S. is pressing for Lebanon. Accept your fate, recognize Israel, everything else be damned. And they're trying to impose that at gunpoint. Maybe they'll be successful in doing that. But this is not a path to peace. This is not diplomacy. This is just war across the region. The West is pressing the government of Lebanon to normalize relations with Israel, whatever that means in the current context. It's extraordinary. So what's happened is their game plan worked, if you could call it working, which is to bring to power a violent, unpredictable government through overthrowing another government that Netanyahu didn't like. And this is basically what's been happening for 30 years, which is Netanyahu has said, get rid of this one, invade Iraq, overthrow the Syrian government, topple Libya. And the United States and others have either found their own reasons or just backed this violent approach. What's happened in Syria is part of a long-term plan that began in 2011 with Obama and Hillary Clinton, Secretary of State, deciding on the overthrow of the Syrian government. It took essentially 13 plus years to do it. Hundreds of thousands of people destroyed Syria, brought to power this regime, which was actually the jihadists backed by the United States from the start. What is it getting us? The whole region is at war. This is what has been the predictable outcome of the failure of these Israeli extremists they don't even have to agree, but I'd say their success, I should say, in blocking the most basic rights of the Palestinian people. And by doing so, they have inflamed the entire Middle East for decades and engulfed the entire Middle East in wars that were totally unnecessary, but really provoked by Israel. So in this sense, nothing about Syria looks anything like the situation with Iran. If there were a war with Iran, it would be horrible, tragic, dangerous, and the potential tinder for World War III. I'm not an Iran expert and I'm not on the ground, but Iran is a formidable country and a formidable civilization. And it has been a country and a civilization for 5,000 years. And it has powerful military assets, and it has a strategic military alliance with Russia. The United States runs a large deficit in its trade in goods and services, what's called the current account of the United States. And that deficit is about $1 trillion. Trump says, oh, that's because other countries are ripping off the United States. I can't even begin to say how absurd that line is. Running a current account deficit means precisely that the United States is spending more than it's producing. That's what leads to a deficit. You spend more than you produce. And we spend more than we produce because we have very low saving in this country because we have an enormous budget deficit. So the government is the national credit card. It runs on credit. It transfers money, pays for wars, pays for Israel's wars, pays for military bases in 80 countries around the world, pays for that more than $1 trillion a year military establishment and hundreds of billions of dollars more of associated spending on the military industrial complex. And it gives tax cuts for the richest Americans, and it allows for tax evasion by the richest Americans, and evasion because it doesn't do audits and it guts enforcement of the tax laws. And so we hemorrhage deficits and have rising public debt. Tariffs are going to lower living standards. They're going to wreck the U.S. economy, and they're being put on for unbelievably bizarre and mistaken reasons that are completely fallacious. So all of this is to say that what Trump calls a ripoff is just the absolute irresponsibility of the political class in Washington. It's a corrupt, plutocratic gangsterism that gives away the taxes and tax cuts to the richest people and goes on war after war on credit. And that leads to these large deficits that Trump then blames on the other countries. Okay, so now he's going to correct these deficits, he thinks, by raising tariffs. And of course, it's going to do nothing of the kind. And because of all of that, the spending of our country is much larger than our national income. It's $1 trillion more than our national income. It is exactly the imbalance of our imports of goods and services over our exports of goods and services. The deficits are going to continue because they come from the profligacy of Washington. They don't come from the fact that other countries are ripping us off. So he'll raise the tariffs. Americans will shift their spending, say, from an imported automobile to domestic automobiles. That's true. They'll pay higher prices for those domestic automobiles, and our auto industry will export less abroad. So, yes, there will be fewer imports and fewer exports, and the balance won't budge. And none of it's going to change the fiscal recklessness, because what's Trump's highest aspiration? It is to continue tax cuts for the richest Americans, which is going to cost another $4 trillion over the next 10 years in the budget, because these tax cuts are supposed to end. But he says, no, these are taxes for my rich donors, so they're going to continue. So I don't know whether it's just rhetoric or ignorance or confusion, but it's unbelievably bad economic policy. It will come to no good. And incidentally, you mentioned rightly that tariffs are, of course, a tax. Who's supposed to have authority over taxes? And Congress has nothing to say in this. This is a one-person show. What did we become in this country? Even King George wouldn't levy taxes without the British Parliament in the 18th century. So what happened to this country? Trump just says, oh, it's an emergency. And now we have one-person rule, and one-person rule on completely fallacious premises that don't pass the first day of study of what a trade deficit is. I taught that for more than 20 years at Harvard University. What is a trade deficit? How does it relate to the excess of spending over production? How does it relate to the excess of investment in a country over a low saving rate? None of this seems to register. No one asks a question. There isn't a day of hearings. There isn't any analysis. It's a one-person show based on economic fallacies that are going to wreck our economy, wreck the world trading system. So he's not going to solve the budget crisis. He's not going to solve the trade deficit, because that comes from the budget crisis. But what he's going to do is lower the living standards of our country and the world, because trade is beneficial in living standards. It's called gains from trade. We buy more cheaply, we sell goods that we have a comparative advantage, and both sides gain from trade. Of course, we overdo it because we overspend, but that's a completely different thing. No one's ripping off the United States by these numbers. And I can tell you, all over the world, because I am talking with leaders all over the world, and recently in Asia, the words to describe this you can't say in polite company. So yes, we're hearing lots of things every day. It's not policy. It is making the entire rest of the world view what's happening in the United States with kind of utter shock at the moment. There's no analysis. There's no systematic policy. There's no law. There is no review. There is no scrutiny. There is one person with his beliefs, his whims, his claims on all of this. And we designed in 1787 in Philadelphia a constitution based on responsibility of three parts of government, assigned tax authority to the Congress, and particularly to the lower house of Congress, where tax legislation has to originate. And our system is being trashed, and it's being trashed for completely erroneous reasons.